Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar series. This is our first installment here in our webinar series. My name is Jared Bleiweiss. I'm with NAES. I'm one of our physical security SMEs here and also our NERC sales guy. And with me, I have Steve Sinclair with Convergint. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jared. Steve Sinclair, I'm the Director of Utilities for Convergint, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Yeah, appreciate it, Steve. So I wanted to kick this off by saying, a lot has gone on lately with physical security in the energy sector. And we're looking forward to covering some of these topics. The first up here in this installment that we have is going to be, what have we seen gone on in the market as far as, in the news, upticks in attacks, and what can we expect looking forward. So without further ado, we'll hop right in it. So within the energy sector, utility sector, whatever you want to call it, we'll probably call it every name in the book here today. We've seen a lot of different things happening in the last 6 to 8 months. Most notably, what we've seen is a rise in ballistic attacks. Many people are aware, most notably, right, we have North Carolina, about 43,000 people lost power out there due to ballistic attacks. But that's kind of a catalyst that set up attacks across the country. Shortly after, we saw some attacks in Washington, the state of Washington, and I believe there was one out in the Midwest as well. And we've seen some smaller attacks spreading out across the country. And these attacks have ranged everywhere from small nuisance attacks, that have had maintenance techs notice a shell casing or two, all the way up to like we've seen in North Carolina, where permanent damage has been caused to transformers. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people have been without power. So it's been on the rise, and the attack range is varied. So it's something that is on the top of everyone's mind, especially within the transmission side of the business. The other thing, though, that hasn't really gotten a lot of public attention, Steve, that I kind of wanted to touch on in here was this rise of threatening letters. This started kind of back around the same time with the North Carolina substation attacks, but these are really being targeted towards generation facilities. And what we've seen is anywhere as far as these letters being delivered that include, bomb threats or any other types of threats to the power facility for any sort of motive. Thankfully, so far, nothing has been, carried out, at least that I've heard in regards to these threats, but it's definitely something that, the rest of the industry should be aware of. It's something that we're seeing an uptick in.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean, you remember back to 2013 when we first had the threat landscape change and had some ballistic attacks occur, and now we had a dip a little bit, and the pressure is back on. So certainly a game changer for the industry.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, talk about game changers. So, one in the energy industry, I'll let you know that, typically speaking, especially, the older, we're going to renewables now, but, the thermal plants, right, are coal, gas, oil plants, right? We're used to the environmental extremists. We've dealt with them for years and years and years, whether it's, protests outside a facility, making, targeted threats. We've dealt with a lot of one-off environmental extremists or even entire activist groups. But now we're starting to see a shift. Those will always be around, but we're starting to see a shift towards domestic violent extremists. And that's that's kind of what we've been seeing as far as a rise that have been carrying out more of these ballistic attacks. So talk about a changing threat landscape. That's something that we want to be aware of as well.
Absolutely.
And then always on everyone's mind too is theft. That's always something that we talk about, whether it's generation or transmission, whether it's stealing copper wires or tools from a maintenance shed. We always keep that at the back of our mind, but especially with, the last few years of, some economic instability, we've seen definitely an increase in copper prices and an increase in theft. So a lot of different things are kind of playing in right now to, this rising and changing threat landscape that we have within the energy sector. So that being said, I wanted to turn some attention to this graphic that I pulled out of the Department of Homeland Security report. Um, Ultimately, what this graphic is showing is attack points. I know it says attack plots, but it's basically areas of attacks by certain groups for critical infrastructure sectors. So there's 6 sectors listed here, and the blue bar is what's noted as white supremacists, which would be our domestic violent extremists. And the orange is a group known as Salafi jihadists. So think of overseas, extremist groups. But what's most notable on this, Steve, is, we typically think about attacks, occurring, whether it's overseas or domestic. And you can note that in every single one of these sectors, just about, the Salafi jihadists, outweigh the white supremacists. But if you look at energy sector right there, I mean, not only is it the most attacked, period, but large in a way, the discrepancy is heavily towards white supremacists. So, as far as these larger scale attacks that we're seeing, it's not an overseas threat. It's right in our backyard. These are folks out in the rural U.S. or even urban, everywhere. So that's something that we got to be aware of as well.
Yeah, it's eye-opening, and we're seeing that residual in all the subvertical markets as well. Not from an attack standpoint, but definitely just an eye towards defense and depth strategies and kind of the change in the thought process from a physical security protective strategy standpoint. So while we're talking about bulk electric generation today and transmission distribution, like I said, there's definitely an eye towards some of the subverticals with water and gas and others, and in terms of, how do we develop our protective strategies and think about these and taking these attack vectors into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I know it wasn't necessarily a physical security attack, but you go back and look at Colonial Pipeline, and that had a major effect on a lot of different areas and a lot of different sectors. But I can tell you, at least from Nays, with folks in the energy sector, we were still very much following that, whether whether you're gas or water or any of the other subsectors you mentioned, right? It's important as critical infrastructure players to be aware of the other sectors around you. So
Absolutely.
So all of this has kind of culminated into one point here. We've kind of seen a changing threat landscape, right, Steve? We've seen change in who's committing the attacks, what the threats are, what the motives are, and just an increase in overall volume of attacks. So there's definitely this changing landscape that we've had. But looking forward as far as the outlook, right? What's been the reaction? What have we seen as far as not only folks within the energy sector, but just within the country, right? Everyday people walking around that have no idea how a power plant runs, but they're still getting fed, the headlines and seeing this. What have we seen coming out that is, calling for change, I guess is lack of better words.
Sure. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, like I said, we've had the increase of attacks, but I think the biggest thing that I kind of wanted to touch on with this was the public pressure. I feel like a lot of people are, calling on the energy sector. What's going on and what are we going to do? What have we seen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, within the industry, I mean, from a physical security standpoint, we're seeing certainly a need and a call for a more technology applications, thought process behind that, whether it be physical security barriers, ballistic protection, increased camera quantity or installations, visual assessment, increased detection, gunshot detection. We're seeing a lot of that from the market right now as it stands. But I think the question really is not the widgets that are out there, but really the why. The why are we doing this? The how are we doing this? And I think there's not a pause, but definitely a consideration on why do we do what we do in terms of looking at and reevaluating the classification of the assets that are out there, what's downstream, the criticality of them, and then how do we protect from a standpoint of adding those different layers and different defense in depth mechanisms and methodologies to increase safety and security for the perimeters and for these facilities.
Yeah, I mean, that why component I know is very important on the operations and energy side. When whether it's a NERC regulation, environmental regulation, or even just something that we need, within a substation or a generation plant, we've got to make sure that we put in something that makes sense, that's not going to get in the way of operations, but ultimately is going to get the job done. So considering, the why, the downstream effects, and prioritizing, what components have more criticality than others is going to be incredibly important going this road. And I think it's a good point that you bring up, as we move forward, talking with folks, that's something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. Yeah, to me, I think that's the most important piece is really, taking in consideration of the regulatory requirements, the threat landscape, the environmental conditions, and public safety. I think, that's the core, those are some of the core elements in terms of determining, how do we implement the proper strategy? And you brought it up as well in terms of kind of this convergence between security and operations. Long gone is the day where you had a single use device like a camera where it was only used for, maybe one application, at best, maybe two. Now we have the capability with AI, machine learning, computer vision, and all these other things that are out there, to leverage, to think about it from a standpoint of defense in depth, but also not as a drain on operations, but as a benefit. So I think we're going to see that as part of this consideration and assessment process of how do we implement the strategy a little bit differently than before to be more effective and safer and provide enhanced levels of security.
Yeah, it's a big consideration that I think everyone's going to have, and the government's no short of it. FERC's already issued their order to NERC, and they've responded, right, to go review some of these physical security standards that are part of NERC. So, that kind of sets us up for our next episode that we're going to have in this series, which we're going to talk about some of the potential regulations that we see coming down the pike and existing regulations. What is it going to mean on the NERC side for security? And we'll probably touch on a little bit of the difference between compliance and security as well. But wanted to set that up. Steve, I very much appreciate your time here today. Your inputs and insights have been incredibly valuable, so thank you.
Thank you.
And for everyone, viewing this, we're looking forward to speaking with you again. We're hoping to be hosting some live Q&A sessions at some point in the future, and stay tuned for our next installments in the series.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yes, you too. Thank you, Stephen.